That's why I want to turn to David as we look forward. What are these opportunities we're seeing as we consider the security and the access and how we actually look at that problem set?
Yeah, so what we're doing is worrying about this future where AIs are going to be asking the questions. And this is really because the abundance and velocity of data generation is already vastly exceeding human capacity to kind of ingest it. So looking at that as the new problem, AIs asking the questions, we decided that what was important is generating a policy-based environment so that you can control what data goes to what entity and under what conditions. And the other thing I want to mention is that, and it's really vital to the whole security discussion, is that now we're in this asymmetric world where we don't know where the problem's going to occur on the earth. So we've started to not only look at the military and intelligence side, but what the civilian world can provide. And you have to deal with getting stuff in and out of the civilian world, in and out of the cleared world, and yet do that at a really high velocity.
Yeah, so you bring up an interesting point, talking about the sort of merging of what's traditionally sort of a government role and a civilian role, especially when we look at data. We use the word control. So when we think about control and what this sort of multi-domain operations mean, when we look out at the Air Force and we think about leadership and traditional sort of notions of control, how is that being forced to change by this paradigm? And sort of what advice can we give to the group as we think about what it means to control, what it means to lead, and what it means to create this sort of access and security? I'll start with Adam.
Sure. Well, I mean, to piggyback a little bit on what Enrique was saying earlier, I think you can democratize this stuff insofar as you can govern it. So the governance and the democratization go hand in hand, and one enables the other. And so I think in that sense, this more traditional method of, again, sort of top-down control on all of this, I think you're starting to see a focus more towards decentralization, again, a focus towards getting the people, in situation, in context, able to do a lot of this work independently so that you can improve the velocity of what you're doing. And I think as you also start to, based on our last talk, hear more and more about how AI is going to help automate a lot of this, again, the focus returns to the data again, because I'll tell you that if your data quality is bad, your machine learning is going to be worthless. And that's like creating a burning platform for organizations to return their focus to like really starting with the data itself and starting to think about how can we actually open this up to more people, and really coming at it from a posture of not how many ways can we say no and how can we lock this down, and let's focus always on the risks, because those are always there. The Air Force is in the risk management business, on behalf of the country. But it's really thinking about, how can we start to come at it from a question of why can't we open this up more, or how could we open this up more so that we can give more access, to the individuals that are making the decisions, in those situations. And I think that changing that mindset or that frame is really, really crucial. And that's not a technology problem. That's really more of a culture, challenge that a lot of organizations, not just in the military, but elsewhere face.
Something that brings up the question we were talking about backstage is how important is culture in multi-domain operations, especially when we're talking about data access and security. So I'll go to Enrique and then to David.
All right, so I'll talk culture. I'll actually kind of go back on the leadership topic as well as part of the culture. I think one of the things we need to start understanding is, from a leadership perspective, senior leaders in the military, is that when you're talking multi-domain operations, none of it is done in isolation. I think we're very used to fighting wars in isolation, both within our domain we fight in and also the region of the world that we fight in. And what leaders need to understand is how technology works, and that an attempt to clamp down on information actually increases the security risk to that information. I'll give some very basic examples. So in a hypothetical situation, you're in some region of the world and you have to do targeting. For a commander, that's important. What the targets they're hitting, that's very important. They got to protect that information. So they lock it down. And now nobody else can see that targeting data. So what happens? Everyone around the world, from Langley Air Force Base to the other combatant commands, to the other regions, to the units that are flying, everybody, because they don't have access to the actual data, they're now duplicating that data in Excel spreadsheets, on whiteboards, in Word documents. They're making phone calls or emailing around. So the attempt to lock down the data because we need to protect our warfight in our region, our domain, has actually dramatically increased the attack surface for how that data is exposed to the world. And so you not only lose data from access, there's an integrity issue to the data because now it's being duplicated, hand jammed. And so we need at some point for senior leadership, and really, and it's not just the leaders, that layer beneath the senior leadership, some people in this room, to understand culturally that we have to be more open in order to be more secure. So,
Yeah, and I mentioned this a minute ago, because we're trying to build the ultimate source of ground truth, if you will, sensor data from around the world. And one thing we're finding is that there's sort of a notion going around that you can create ad hoc data trading alliances based on changing events. And as we know, who we're friends with, who we're not friends with, pretty dynamic. And so the idea that you can change the policy based on the situation is kind of the new notion. But that means you have to know a lot about the data in the first place and what's okay to send across the transom to one of our allies, for example, or even another branch. I will also mention, though, that there really is this incredible abundance of what they call Internet of Things data out there. You can know what's happening in a region by what the cars are spitting out, and a lot of really interesting things like that, power grids. And really, that has never been abundantly available to the warfighter before. So I think as we move and watch the world change, this is all going to require a lot of policy-based handling of the data, quality control of what data, who does what to whom. And again, knowing that changes on the fly.
So we talk about the pitfalls of trying to clamp down and sort of over-secure. We talk about sort of flexible policies and trading alliances. Adam talked a little bit earlier about that data strategy. So talk to me about partnerships, not just sort of service to service or nation to nation, but as we're thinking about a public-private partnership, commercial data, sort of non-standard, how do we start setting foundations for that data strategy and working on the access side of this from data in, not data out? Go to Enrique. You made eye contact first.
Oh, man, my mistake. We're loved over here what you guys said. It's easier to riff off of somebody than to start from yourself.
Right.
So commercial partnerships. I think one of the real issues we've had, and the DoD has had this problem now for probably 3, 4, 5 years, at least when we started looking into it, the DoD started getting really big into Silicon Valley, stand up at DIUX, DDS, DIB. There's a lot of these organizations. One of the first things we saw is we find this great commercial technology, and there's no way to bring it into the DoD. And there's ignoring the contracts piece. That's a nightmare, and I realize we're going to try to fix the contracts piece. From a technical perspective, the DoD technologies just were too out of date, weren't compatible with commercial sector, and then security policies. You want to try to bring that data in and move it up classification level. If the provenance of that data wasn't for something secure, you can never actually push it through that domain. Now it's people literally still, in 2019, burning CDs to move data across. And now try that in a world of IoT and streaming data. And so I think the commercial partnerships and work in the commercial sector, it's not so much about what we need the commercial companies to do for us, it's what we as the DoD need to do to enable commercial companies. We actually need networks that I can pool more than a meg of bandwidth for long haul, because it's been clamped down by security controls at every level. We need underlying infrastructure that actually allows for management of data, security of data, the entire data wrangling. I'll use your terminology from your company. Data wrangling. We don't have that infrastructure in place, especially at a worldwide scale. And we don't have the compute power right now. And I realize we're targeting all these things in the DoD, but we have to do it faster, because the commercial partnerships right now, it's honestly my personal view, is we're falling down on the DoD side. We can't bring your technology in. We just can't do it. So,
Adam, I want to turn to you on that one. We talked a lot about sort of that data strategy and how we're setting that in place.
Yeah. So yes, and yes. I mean, I will violently agree with everything Enrique just said. I mean, I do think that this stuff is moving fast, right? I mean, it is amazing as you start talking about now third-party data, open data, dark data. This data onboarding challenge is not just a multi-domain problem within the different initiatives within the Air Force, but it's really now saying how can we use all the information that is now increasingly and abundantly available to get to better decisioning and to ultimately make the missions more successful. And that means that it's really sometimes less about the volume of this data and the velocity of the data, which gets a lot of attention, but it starts to become more about the variety of the data. Because even small data, if you're talking about thousands of spreadsheets, or you're talking about things that are ferreted away into dark corners and in different types of applications, like unlocking the potential of that and making sure that people can go in and again get eyes on it, see for themselves, help themselves, I think is really, really crucial, because you have a tremendous number of incredibly brilliant people working at all levels within the Air Force that that if they can get access to this information, they're going to come up with ideas that are going to inspire the next generation of missions and outcomes for everyone. And I think it's a lot about how do you crowdsource the best stuff from all those people, right? How do you do this at sort of a more of a grassroots level rather than expecting everything to come top down? And I think that model is a model that we're seeing play out in the commercial sector. And the idea is that you're going to have these intergalactic data models that are kind of handed down from on high that pre-anticipate every question that anybody could ever ask. It's just not realistic, right? This stuff just changes too fast, and the data changes too fast.
No top-down policies, thank you.
So you really have to organize around that, and your data strategy ultimately starts to reflect your organizational design. It reflects. It really kind of reflects how you grow up as a group. So
the next sort of place I want to take that is the trust. So we talk about the variety of the data, we talk about quality of the data, some of the access, some of the security. As we're talking about all these different sources, whether it's IoT, whether it's commercial partnerships, how do we start to address some of the trust issues of, is it good data? Right? Are we actually able to make decisions often? How are we either securing that sort of point of access down at the end there, or how are we validating, verifying, however you want to word it, and looking at trust and getting to truth?
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems with breaking that down is if you try to go to the level of the individual actor, it gets incredibly unwieldy, especially if we're talking about this quote unquote crowdsourcing. What we've figured out is that you have to do it through this curatorial function in the way that, say, a bank does. So we looked a lot at the banks and the whole finance system for a trust model because, let's face it, they've had to figure that out a long time ago. And dealing with civilian actors, commercial actors, governmental actors. And so usually the idea is you have this sort of Switzerland where everything, the trust is curated at that level. So you don't necessarily worry about whether that entity is the trusted entity as long as you've qualified the data coming out of it as being okay to put into the system. And then the trust relationship is between the convening entity and all the consumers of the data. So I know that's a little esoteric, but it really does make sense because if you look at the most scaled systems in the world, like global finance, telecommunications, containerized shipping, air traffic control, there's always some curatorial layer where so like if a Cessna comes into my airspace, I may not know the guy that owns the Cessna, but I know a lot about that plane until it transits out of my airspace. And it's the same with things like containers, same with financial transactions. So it kind of begs for there to be some kind of a brain in the middle.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to actually elevate that up a level. So it'd be great if we could trust data about especially the quality of data, the veracity of data, the provenance of the data. I don't think we're there yet. The reason is we can't get to the data. So when we talk about trust, the real problem right now we have in the DoD, and that's why I'm going to talk to Lauren, you're going to help me with this, it's trust among organizations. We do not have enough trust among organizations to allow systems to talk to each other. So if I want to get one database on one base to talk to a database on another base, that process is probably going to be months long merely to open up the firewall port to allow those two systems to touch. I'm not even looking at the data yet. We're not even getting to the point where we're saying, is it even good data? I can't even get to the point that I can look at the data without taking months because there's a lack of trust in the system based off of our very castle wall security model that we have in the DoD. To break through those castle walls at any point requires almost an act of God. And it's about that process, with a lot more steps along the way, though. That's what we need to tackle first, is the trust among organizations and a trust among networks, trust among systems, so that we can start looking at the data and figure out, can we even trust the data? But we're not there yet, and I think we need to tackle that first.
So I'm going to follow that up with something that we talked about a little bit earlier. When we talk about not there yet, we talk about the castle mentality. Yeah. Some of these challenges by sort of building bigger walls, going elbows out. What should security look like in multi-domain operation? Not what does it look like, how do we behave now? What should it look like? And I'm going to start right back at you, Enrique.
Great. As the non-technologist on this panel, I will give you my idea of what security should look like. In an ideal world, security should look something like a zero trust network. We have to assume that we've been breached at all moments of time. That should be, as any security professional, our mindset should be assume breach. I should be able to build out a network assuming that the Chinese are watching everything I do. And I should let them watch everything I do. Run off commercial internet, doesn't really matter. Let's build out that security inside of that based off of context. I love the word context. The context of who you are as a person, what your risk profile is, the context of what your system is. Is it a government system, non-government system, managed, unmanaged, up to date, not up to date? What networks are you running off? Commercial, government, partner, doesn't really matter. Our security should be based off of context, in which case now you're building out a zero trust network based off of that context to give you access to whether it's a network resource or data itself. That is a model that the commercial sector is going to have. And I've talked to a lot of companies who are abandoning firewalls, going more towards a zero trust model. That's where we need to drive towards. And there's a lot of experiments going this way. I know Mr. Marion's in the front row. I know he's working a lot of experiments on zero trust as well. This is where we should be going. I would like us to get there a little faster.
Adam, I want to get your take on that too. When you think about sort of what optimal security looks like, what it really should look like, sort of removing the constraints of today, kind of how would you lay that out?
Yeah, I mean it's a tough question because I guess there's no sort of simple answer. I think in the end it is a risk-adjusted framework, right? And again, that was my point about how Air Force is in the risk management business, and so you guys are really comfortable with this. So but it needs to apply to your data as well. And I think that there is certain types of data that absolutely does need to get locked down, and you have to be incredibly careful with because lives are at stake. And then there's a lot of data though that I feel like because it is not necessarily understood. The predisposition is to just say, well, if we don't know what's in there, then lock it tight. And I think that we're trying to challenge the assumption of not necessarily focusing on like just it's the right data for the right person at the right moment in time, but it's like because that is contextual, really trying to say, well, why can't we think about it more for like more data for more people more of the time, and start from a posture that is more open and proactive when it comes to data use and consumption, rather than more defensive, where we say, well, here's all the reasons why we can't or shouldn't open this up. And I think that for me, as I sort of wind it forward, I think a little bit about I was in a meeting with some folks that were working on movies for DreamWorks, and they said, it's really challenging because somebody comes up with a new idea and they'll put it forward to the team. And within 10 minutes, everybody sitting around the table comes up with all these reasons why that won't work and why that's too hard or why that's never been done before. And so they instituted a rule, and they said, before anybody is allowed to say anything about why this is hard or why this won't work, every single person has to go around the table and talk about why this could work and why it's a good idea. And it completely changed the nature of the discussion, because then the positive ideas and the ways to embrace the ideas fed on each other, and you then all of a sudden saw movies getting made that might not have ever seen the light of day. And so I think it's a little bit around sort of thinking that through and trying to apply some of those principles as we go forward.
So if we had an organization that came and asked one of you guys, hey, how do I get started? How do I look at sort of balancing access and security? How do I think about it? What advice would you offer to an organization that's trying to break this down and start to build their own sort of plan, build their own strategy? How do they get started?
Sure. Well, first of all, a couple things the guys touched on. I think we have to realize there's this perpetual tension between what I'm going to call access control, speed of the need of information, and then sort of, what we've always done and how do you break through that. And to kind of get from what you were talking about could take months and get it down to milliseconds so that you can make things happen. I think there's just a lot of policy decisions that have nothing to do with technology about how to, get open while still maintaining a security balance. I know that sounds real easy to say and really hard to do. I just know that, we've been looking at a lot of these issues of data silos, and I'm always reminded of the great scene in Top Gun where he says, how long will it take to fix the catapults? And he goes, 10 minutes. And he goes, 10 minutes? This thing's over in 2 minutes. And come on, the scene. Right?
Yeah.
And I just imagine as the velocity of data is happening more and more, we're going to get into more and more scenarios where you really need this stuff resolved now with inter-domain transfers of information. So probably the best way to really start that dialogue is, it's kind of what we're doing here, is to admit that everybody's got their silos. You need to start being, like you said, open to why it could work. And then you can go around and talk about the legacy things that are keeping it from working. And I think all of that is a human interaction policy thing before you even get to the tech.
So, playing on some.
Yeah, I'm gonna put this into Air Force speak. If I was an organization coming to me saying, how do you get going? I'll just say, just start.
Yeah.
Don't actually plan it too much. There's a lot out there, just start. And so in Air Force speak, the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act. So I'm gonna make Boyd roll over his grave. Start with act. Act first, then you observe and orient based off of what you did, and then you decide whether it's the right decision to move forward or wrong decision, change it. Just apply the OODA loop and start with an A in the OODA loop, and you're totally fine. Don't sit around and strategize for too long.
Yep.
You miss the opportunity.
Yeah, I would just add too, the successful projects we've seen also take a small unit of work end to end. That you run into situations where people want to build all these things in complex layers, and each layer takes years. And then by the time you get to the end, everything has changed underneath you anyway, or people have found workarounds and have moved on, and your solution ends up not being applicable. So I always try to encourage people, especially as they're modernizing or they're going through digital transformation and they're thinking through all these complex topics, because it's not just about security, it's about lots of other things as well. Find something small and well-defined, action it very, very quickly, take it end to end on a very tight timeline. That's measured in days or weeks, not measured in months or years, and test your hypothesis and iterate very, very quickly, right? And I think that, and then grow, because then all of a sudden you have something you can merchandise. You have success stories that you can take out and you can start to share with the community. And when that happens, the ideas start coming and people start showing up with their data and they start showing up with their questions and their problems, and it's incredibly powerful. But make sure you don't get stuck saying, well, until we define all the security for anything anybody would ever want to do with any of this kind of data, we can't move forward on any project. Because I've seen organizations, not just in the government, but in financial services and others, that then, again, years go by, and then what people end up doing is they say, listen, I can't wait on this because I've still got missions to deliver, I've still got problems to go solve, and so I'm going to go do my own thing. And now you're creating, to your point, more of a security problem, or you're creating more fragmentation, you're creating more redundancy, and more potential versions of the truth, all of which I think are counterproductive.
So, we've talked about some of the culture challenges, some of the policy challenges, some of the technology-specific challenges. Just talked and sort of cautioned against admiring a problem and having that sort of bias to action. So as we start to kind of wrap this up, how do you set conditions for that? Recognizing that one group's going to have a better understanding of how the technology actually works. A different group's going to be quite savvy on the policy. Some's going to have some of the organizational constructs. How do you bring those diverse groups together and really get them on the same page and set conditions so when you do seek those early victories and you've got something you can merchandise, that you've built a channel for it to go out and grow? Mm-hmm. And I'll start with David.
So again, we're doing a lot of straddling of the civilian and governmental worlds. The biggest issue right now is that everybody has their fiefdoms, and the real I think what Adam said is right on, that you've got to start by just take a little baby steps, but knowing that it could scale. And I think the hardest part, which is also true in big corporations, if you know that it can scale, that's the right path out of the 20 you could have taken. But again, it really is a combination of technological policies, human policies, meaning, how do we work together and play well with others? And, and really looking at the fact that the pace of change is really radical now. So, I mean, one thing that's fascinating is that it used to be that the coolest technology was always in the hands of large companies and governments, but now literally 2-year-olds get the same iPad that the head of a Secretary of Defense would have, literally the same iPad. So, we're finding there's a lot of good cues from the civilian world in not only data generation, data handling, but also security and policies, as well. Like, how do you just start small, but make sure you pick the one that could go to a long-term deployment.
So we're wrapping up right on the end here, but just to sort of pull some of this together, you know, where we started out on this, it sounded like we were talking about an either or. How do we talk about access, or how do we talk about security? And sort of through this discussion, you've seen it's more of a yes and. And how do we start to just get that biased action, not overthink it? Everything sort of doesn't require an eloquent strategy, which all of us in DoD have probably built a bunch of fantastic PowerPoint slides that never got to a decision and spent countless hours in there. So how do we get that bias to action? And from a leadership standpoint, I guess my sort of parting challenge is, how do we create space, true space, for our subordinates to get out there and start acting and to give teams the ability to grow? And it's groups like this, there we go. It's groups like this that are doing it. So I want to thank everybody. I want to thank our panel, and thanks for giving us the time today. Enjoy lunch, guys.
Thanks.